Hello, my name is Dr. James Christ. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and certified substance abuse counselor and clinical director at the Child and Family Counseling Center in Woodbridge, Virginia. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, Helping Kids Manage Their Anger. This is a talk that I've wanted to give for quite some time now, so I appreciate being invited by Parent Resource Center and a Circle of Support, Jan Russell. So I will give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. I will take questions from time to time. So, so problems with expressing anger constructively, I think, continues to be a challenging problem for kids and teens. It seems to me kids seem too free to express their anger in ways that our parents would never have tolerated. Everyone in a family can be affected when anger becomes unmanageable. And while learning to handle big emotions such as anger, it's a normal part of growing up. Certainly some kids express their anger in horribly tragic ways as well. I mean, we've had issues with school shootings, stabbings between teens over something that seems to us so trivial, okay? And again, one of the things that I hear from parents all the time, if I had ever dared to talk to my mom the way my son talks to me, I would have not been able to sit still for a week, okay? So why is anger such a problem? One second, there we go. Is it more of a problem today with things like bullying and whatnot? And I do think it is more of a problem today. I think there's an increase in stress from multiple sources, from pandemic to financial to political differences and whatnot. And so one of the things we know is that when people are under more stress, their anger control tends to suffer. It's much harder to control your anger when you're already on the edge. Ron Chappell, the author of the book Breaking Through to Teens, talks of a culturally induced anxiety that seems like it's making it harder than ever for kids and teens to succeed. Think of the pressure in terms of grades, in terms of jobs, in terms of college, the loss of blue-collar workers, that there are fewer jobs for people where you don't need a higher education. So it creates a lot of pressure because not everybody is going to be able to succeed at college or want to do that. Is it bad parenting? Now, a lot of times parents will blame themselves for problems, but I think the extremes are where you run into trouble. If you are too permissive and never set limits, then your kids walk all over you. Yeah, there's going to be some problems there. If you're too strict and too authoritarian and you don't give your kids many choices, you're also going to see some reaction from the kids as well. Is it first-person shooter games or other video games? Does that cause more anger? We know that a lot of the kids who've gone on to commit school shootings, etc., they tend to be obsessed with these games. So, and I know all parents struggle with how much access to give their kids. While most of us would agree that Call of Duty at age 5 is probably not a good idea, not everybody agrees with that, but it's something to keep in mind, I think. Multiple negative consequences of anger. One of the concerns about anger, one of the reasons why I felt this is such an important talk, is that not being able to manage anger constructively can lead to things like physical and verbal violence, prejudice, antisocial behaviors, addiction, withdrawal, psychosomatic disorders, headaches, stomach aches, etc. The negative expression of anger can destroy lives, affect your physical health, ruining your future if you get arrested for your anger control. So one of the things to keep in mind, again, it's not just anger that's the problem. Kids have always become angry. But I think it's important as parents to realize that being a kid or a teenager is inherently frustrating. It's a normal thing to be frustrated. After all, who wants to be told what to do all the time? To be told you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't wear this, you can't have your hair that way, you got to do your homework, etc. So it's very normal that kids are going to be more frustrated. And as you'll hear as we go on to the talk, kids are told they're not supposed to express their anger. They have to always be respectful at all times, and that's just not realistic. Okay. So if you've seen the movie Inside Out, there's an expression of anger. That's often how it feels to kids. That's the part of your brain that just expresses it without any thoughts as to the consequences. I found this book, which is in your resource list at the end of the talk, Anger Management for Parents, because I think that also expresses pretty well how many of you may feel when dealing with anger issues. All right. So in terms of the talk, I'm going to talk about why kids get angry. We'll talk about the 3 different components of anger that help you understand it. I'll address some misperceptions about anger, the biology of anger, why it is that our brains are wired for anger. I will review a number of psychiatric disorders and how anger problems stem from some of those disorders. We're going to talk about parents' role in dealing with a child's anger, things that you may do that may make it harder for your children to deal with anger. All right. Hold on one second. There we go. I'm just hang up the phone. That works better. All right. So why do kids get angry? Well, frustration, something not going right. You can't figure out your homework, you're failing a test. If you think that you're not as smart or as talented athletically as your peers, it's going to be frustrating when you try to do something. You try to say, try out for a team and you never get chosen, for example. Not getting your way, being told to do something you don't want to do, such as clean your room, do chores, do homework, etc., come home on time. That is frustrating. Feeling unfairly treated, okay, by peers, by teachers, by parents, things like that, siblings. You probably heard your kids say, this is not fair, you're not treating me the same. You like him better, you love him better, things like that. So one of the interesting things about being treated unfairly also is that kids are told that they can't sort of argue back and be disrespectful, but if you have an adult or a teacher or an older sibling who's disrespectful to the child, you're expecting the child to handle it constructively, and that's a very difficult thing. Conflict over possessions, that's also very common, especially in a family where you have kids, maybe there are certain toys, certain games they want anybody else to play with. What's kind of interesting about that is sometimes a child will not play with a toy for a long time, and then the younger brother or sister wants to play with it, and all of a sudden it's their favorite toy and they don't want anybody to touch it. So I think that's understandable as well, that if you're told that you have to share everything and you don't own anything, that can create some trouble. So, all right. Being hurt in some way, okay, being rejected, being criticized, hit, teased, bullied. Anger is a normal reaction to being hurt, okay? With sadness going to build in there as well. And it's hard not to strike back when you're hurt in that respect. So let's move on to feeling powerless. Having no say in what happens to you, feeling powerless that nothing that you can do is going to make the situation better, also results in anger. It's one of the reasons why it's so important that kids have some say in what's going on with them and decisions to make, so that they are less likely to, they feel like they have some control over it, they're less likely to get upset. That's why giving kids choices, again, is so important. Feeling neglected. If you are, as most parents are, struggling to balance work responsibilities, home responsibilities, etc., it's very difficult. Being rejected, being discounted are all things that can trigger anger. One of the things I want to mention here real quick is that most kids prefer negative attention to no attention. And so if you find your child doing all sorts of things and your first reaction is to go to that child and criticize them or punish them for being angry, you're probably doing something wrong. It may be that they are wanting the attention, but they're just getting it in the wrong way. So one thing that is really helpful for kids who feel this way is to let them know, hey, if you want some attention, just ask me. Say, Mom, I need some attention. That's much better than acting up and causing problems, okay? So in summary, kids get upset and angry for many of the same things that we do, okay? So when you're losing your cool with your child or others in your life, remember kids feel the same way and some of the same frustrations. Remembering also that their brains are not fully formed, and so they do not have the impulse control that an adult is expected to have, okay? So Dr. Ross Green, the author of the book, The Explosive Child, which is an excellent book if you have kids who struggle with severe anger problems, he says that kids do well when they can, okay? If kids cannot do well, if they cannot handle a situation well, that is a sign of a lagging skill. And if you look at it that way, it may help you to react more positively and not take it so personally, okay? Think of it, if you're 3 years old and you're crying and you need comfort, you're not going to try to talk the way out of it. You're going to pick up your child, maybe comfort them, redirect them to feel better, because you know that they don't have the emotional resources. So keep that in mind with regard to kids as well. All right, let's talk about the 3 components of anger. I find it's helpful to separate these components to understand what's going on with people with anger problems, and also how to intervene, which I'll explain in a bit. So the emotional state of anger has to do with your angry feelings, okay? It can be mild, such as in just mild irritation. It can be severe, such as rage. It goes on a continuum, okay? So, and when you're getting that angry, you're having, your heart beats faster, your breathing gets faster, your stomach may be upset, your blood pressure rises, all things that are actually getting ready to fight or run away, the fight or flight response, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. Passive aggressive anger is also something that can happen here. That with passive aggressive behavior, you're not expressing it directly, you're expressing it indirectly. A good example of passive aggressive anger is a child saying, okay, yeah, I'll clean up my room, and then purposely doing it slowly or conveniently forgetting about the chore or the homework. That's a way of trying to fight back. And they know that they're getting a little less trouble. If they say, no, I'm not going to do this, they'll get in trouble. If they say, yes, I'm going to do it, and then they drag their feet, that's another sign that there's some underlying anger, okay? And obviously, with the physical expression of anger behaviors, there's a lot of different ways people express it, yelling, screaming, throwing things, hitting, retaliating. Cognitive understanding of anger is the third component, and that refers to your thoughts and beliefs about anger, or about a situation in general that is triggering some anger. For example, if you think your kid is just being a brat when having a tantrum, you're more likely to get mad because you think they're doing it purposely to get you upset. If, on the other hand, you think that your child is having a tantrum because she is exhausted for some other reason or overwhelmed, you might see it as more understandable and be able to soothe your child and calm her down more quickly, okay? So, and the cognitive understanding of anger is one of the areas that we can intervene very successfully. So we work with kids on helping them think about a situation differently. Even something to this effect. If you kids who've come to me and say, okay, I'm in trouble for this, this, or this, and I say, do you think the consequence is fair? And they'll say, yeah, I said I was going to do it and I didn't do it, so I understand that it's fair. So when a child perceives a situation or even a consequence is fair, they're less likely to be anger. And it makes it easier for them to accept responsibility for what happened. Okay. Here's some examples of some angry behaviors. These are very common things that kids do. Sometimes adults do the same thing, hopefully not the rolling on the floor or hitting themselves. But this is a good idea in terms of if you want to share this with your kids, give them some ideas as to ways that people show their anger. And then you can talk about the different ways. Okay, do you think hitting things, is that a good idea? Is it okay to hit pillows but not people? Clenching your fists, yelling and screaming, etc. All right. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about some misperceptions about anger. So I think society gives us contradictory messages when it comes to anger. I'm sure you've said or heard things like, if someone hits you, just hit them back. Or don't hit others, but you'll get spanked if you hit your little sister. Turn the other cheek, just don't respond, don't engage if somebody's being mean to you or hurting you. Tell an adult, which we tell kids, but then don't be a tattletale. And so some of these kids will tell their teacher, hey, this happened. And the teacher says, well, work it out yourselves. And then, okay, so why did I go to you in the first place? If the child knew how to work it out, he or she probably wouldn't be going to the teacher or to a parent and asking for help. Don't get angry, get even. That kind of retaliation can cause all sorts of trouble. And again, to work it out yourselves. So one of the things for you, and I'm going to remind you this as well, we'll talk about it more in a bit. So if kids come to you and they're arguing or angry about something, one of your roles should be as a consultant to help them express themselves so that both people feel understood and then come up with solutions to deal with the problem, okay? If you hear each of the book Siblings Without Rivalry is a good book about these sorts of things. You listen to each person, why they're angry, you reflect it back to them, and then you say, okay, so what are some ways that you can handle this? How would you like to make this situation better? And then you're problem solving, you're brainstorming for different ways of doing it. And when you do that, you're calming them down so that they can actually use their brains to make better choices. So, all right. So let's talk about misperceptions and what some of the facts are. Here's some of the, again, misperceptions about anger. All anger is unhealthy or destructive. Anger is an all or nothing phenomenon. Either you blow up or you don't. If you don't let your anger out, it builds up and explodes, sort of like a teapot or a tea kettle. Angry people yell and scream a lot. Or anger management means keeping your mouth shut. Okay? So none of those are true. The opposites are true. So not all anger is unhealthy or destructive. So remember that sometimes anger is justified. If somebody breaks something of yours, you're going to be upset. If somebody hits you, you're going to be upset. If you see somebody else being hurt, somebody that you care about, you may be angry or upset. If you're angry about a situation in the world that you think is not fair or hurting other people, I mean, anger actually can motivate you to take action in a positive way. Of course, if you're overreacting and if you're throwing fits over minor irritations, that is more unhealthy, of course. One thing to keep in mind here, that research shows that among all the risk factors for heart disease, chronic anger is one of the top ones. It's the most significant predictor, more than smoking, obesity, and high blood pressure, which is interesting. So again, one of the things to think about is it's important for all of us to learn how to express it constructively. All right, anger is not an all or nothing phenomenon. That's where the anger, like a thermometer, there's an anger ladder I'll show you in a minute here. It's helpful for kids to learn how to sort of describe that anger. So if your anger is at a 2 versus a 10, you might do something different when your anger is at a 2 or 3 than you would if your anger is at an 8 or 9. So think of it as like a dial where you're dialing it up or dialing it down. One of the things we're trying to do is help kids dial it down so they're thinking more clearly. Okay? It's not always necessary to let your anger out. That is true. For some people, if they let their anger out all the time, it actually makes them angrier. Other people, if they keep it all inside, isn't good either, because that makes them feel bad about themselves. It can create headaches, stomach aches, etc. So one of the things we sometimes tell kids is to punch a pill or something like that. Is that a good way, a bad way? I think if you let your anger out, some kids, if they do something like that, they feel better. So it's letting it out. Some people just go for a walk or take a break in your room, watch something on YouTube or whatever, so that you don't always have to let it out. Because sometimes after you process it and you think about it, maybe you realize you overreacted. So giving it some time to process is a very good strategy. Not all angry people yell and scream. A couple points I want to make here. With the passive aggressive anger I was talking about earlier, again, if your child feels like there's nothing he or she can do to have an influence on a situation and they're not happy about it, they go underground. And so they may actually, for example, hurting their siblings might be a way of expressing their anger at you for not spending enough time with them or favoring one child over the other. And again, whether you feel that you're treating your kids equally, but kids may feel like they may feel a little different. And it's their perception of it, not necessarily the reality, that causes the problem. So the other thing to keep in mind, and I think you see this with kids a little bit more as well, one thing that some people do when they're angry is they withdraw. So if you have a child who's always in her room and you feel bad about it, you say, you're always in your room. You might want to ask why. Teenagers are more likely to spend time in the room, and that's a normal thing. But keep in mind the possibility that they are withdrawing from you because they're angry at you and they don't like interacting, or they don't like what you said, or they don't like a consequence that you gave them. So it's harder to identify that type of anger, which also makes it a little bit harder to help them with it if you don't know what's going on underneath. Anger management does not mean keeping your mouth shut. Okay, you're probably familiar with the term assertiveness, and kids can learn how to do this as well. That you can be, if you're upset about a situation, you can either be very passive about it and do nothing. You can be very aggressive about it and overreact to a situation, or you can be assertive, which is in the middle. And so being assertive with your anger involves expressing your feelings and letting others know how you feel without trying to hurt that person back, okay? To be able to say, hey, I was really mad at you for not letting me go outside. That would be an assertive way of expressing a feeling, okay? Because one of the things we're wanting to do is we're trying to get kids to verbalize their anger in appropriate ways so that you know what's going on and then you can try to look for solutions. If your child is able to say to you, Dad, I'm really angry at you right now, even if they're using an angry tone, it's a perfectly appropriate way to express it, far better than hitting or throwing things. So if you let your child know, hey, thanks for letting me know. I know that you're really angry at me for not letting you go outside, instead of trying to shame the child or tell them, don't talk to me that way. I'll give you some other ideas about how to deal with that in a little bit as well. Any questions so far? I see. What resources are available in the local area to help parents and children learn better emotional management. They're actually, Rhonda or Jan may be able to answer this better, but I know there's this classes. I think it's Virginia Cooperative Extension. Am I right on that? Maybe they can look into that and sort of share that with you at the end. All right, I think that's it.
I said yes on the cooperative extension.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. Anger is a surface emotion. The root cause requires parents to take a pause, check their own emotions, and then respond in a way that's helpful. Absolutely. One of the things I will tell parents is that your job as a parent is to be a fire extinguisher, not somebody who throws gasoline on the fire. And when you yell in reaction to your child yelling, it's like throwing gas on a fire. And so but you can help your kids calm down and express themselves more appropriately by you not overreacting to the situation. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. All right, let me talk a little next about the biology of anger. I'm not going to get into all the different brain components, but I think it's important to understand, for you to understand as well as your kids to understand why we get angry, why it's difficult to control it, and knowing something about biology, what can we do to work with that, all right? So just very briefly, the frontal lobes of the brain are the newest parts of the brain. They're responsible for thinking, processing, analyzing, things like that. Impulse control. The temporal lobe has to do with emotional functioning. That's your fight or flight center. So if you're sensing danger, that part gets activated. Okay, this is another example of the prefrontal cortex that I want to talk about here. These are some of the tasks of the prefrontal cortex: empathy, insight, response, flexibility, etc. If you look at those sorts of functions, you can see how that also relates to anger control, to be able to regulate your emotions, to be more flexible in your responses, okay? So when your prefrontal cortex is well developed, you should be capable of doing these things. The limbic system, on the other hand, is part of the fight, flight, or freeze response, okay? So if that part of your brain senses danger, that part gets activated, and that's where you get upset, you get your muscles are tight, your breathing is rapid, you're trying to get ready to either fight whatever perceived danger there is, or to run away to keep yourself safe, okay? So what you see, these two little round things, those purple things behind, that's the amygdala. And there are actually two of them. And that's your kind of like your fear switch or your red alert system. So one of the things that happens when you get angry is that system gets triggered, and then again, you're in a fighting mode. The problem with today's stresses is most of them are not resolved by fighting or running away, but your brain reacts the same way as it always has for years, thousands of years, millions of years, to keep you safe. So one of the things that sometimes happens when it comes to anger controls, we call it neural hijacking. And let me explain what that means. Neural hijacking means that if you're sensing danger, let's say you see something coming at you, your amygdala, your fear center, will switch in and turn off the thinking parts of the brain. And why is that? If you're being chased by a wild animal and you stop and think about it, you say, well, gee, what should I do? I wonder why that tiger is running after me. You know, maybe the tiger's just looking for food. I don't know. When you stop and think, you're going to get eaten, right? Because by the time you do all that, you're not going to be able to fight or run away. So the limbic system will shut off the thinking parts of the brain to keep you alive, to keep you safe. But again, as I said before, today's dangers obviously don't generally involve fighting or running away, or freezing, which is another response to try to stay safe. So your job with regard to dealing with kids is, again, to help those frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, stay activated so that part of your brain can sort of overrule and tamp down the emotional or the reptilian brain. Sometimes people refer to that part of your brain as reptilian because reptiles, their brains are about keeping safe, eating, and reproducing, basically. That's they don't have frontal lobes in that way, okay? All right, let me move on. All right, I already referred to this. Brain doesn't fully mature until age 25, which is interesting because that's when car insurance rates are lowered, because at that point, people generally drive more safely because they're not taking as many risks. And the brain matures from the back to the front. So the frontal lobes of the brain mature last, okay? So over time, and this is what we see as well, that kids, teenagers, they're going to have more trouble controlling their emotions. As they get older, it gets easier because their brain is more fully developed. So you can't expect a child of 10 to have the same level of impulse and anger control as somebody who's 25, 35, etc. Neurotransmitters are brain chemicals your brain uses to communicate. There's a number of different neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters basically refers to your nerve cells communicating with each other. And they do that by releasing these chemicals, which activate the next nerve cell. And I don't want to go too far into that, but just a couple of things. Serotonin is one that affects mood, anxiety, and sleep. So if your levels of serotonin are low, this is the theory, that you may have more trouble with being more angry, more depressed, have a harder time sleeping. So one of the things we know that some of the anger problems are due to depression, and you treat it with medication that boosts the levels of serotonin, the angry responses tend to lower and get easier to control. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that makes things pleasurable. If you're doing something fun, your brain produces a sense of dopamine that makes you want to do it again. So that is rewarding. Norepinephrine is more involved in the fight or flight response. That's the part that gets you sped up. And then GABA is one that's involved in anxiety. And this is an oversimplification, which is to know that these are some of the chemicals that in your brain may be dysregulated if your child is someone who has more trouble than most kids dealing with emotion. All right. We do know that lower levels of these chemicals, especially serotonin, are associated with higher levels of violent behavior in some of the studies that have been done. One last brain scan. Dr. Daniel Amen of the Amen Clinic. He is someone who does SPECT imaging. He takes scans of the brain to see where the activity level is. And when you see the blue, that's normal activity. Where you see the red, that is excessive activity. He calls this the ring of fire brain profile. And what that means is that for some people, their brain can't shut off. And so if you have somebody in your family who once they get angry can't let it go, they just keep obsessing about it and pounding away, this may be part of why that happens. They can't turn their brains off the way other people can do it. As you know, some people can just let it roll off their back. Okay, I can't do this, I'll just do something else. No big deal. Whereas other kids, they fight and argue as if it's like the worst thing that could ever happen to them in their entire life. Okay, let me talk a little bit about these disorders. I'm not going to talk about them in too much detail. What I want you to listen for is how these disorders affect expression of anger. So ADHD. ADHD has to do with being inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive. Those are the three core symptoms, okay? Kids with ADHD tend to be more disorganized. They have more trouble at school because they don't want to do their homework. They'll lose things. They're distracted easily, things like that. So, but keep in mind that one of the core symptoms is often impulsivity, doing things without thinking about the consequences. And if you are impulsive, it is harder to control your anger because it just comes out of your mouth before you've even had a chance to process it. So if you're seeing that, if your child has ADHD and they're impulsively reacting in a way, try not to assume that they're trying to be disrespectful. It may just be that they're overloaded and the frontal lobes of the brain didn't kick in quick enough to tamp down the emotional parts of the brain. Okay. Kids with ADHD also have a lot more baseline frustration. School is inherently frustrating because you have to sit still for hours a day. And now, of course, you got to wear a mask. And that's very difficult for kids with ADHD. But oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. Kids with ODD tend to argue a lot. They're easily annoyed. They may annoy you on purpose. They're quick to say no when they're asked to do something they don't want to do, and they tend to blame others. ODD often goes along with ADHD. And interestingly, if you have a child with both and you treat the ADHD, the ODD tends to get better because if they have more impulse control and their ability to do well in school and at home improves, they're not going to be quite so oppositional. So if you have somebody who's being oppositional with you, question for you to ask is, why is my child fighting me on this? Is there something about this activity I'm asking them to do overwhelming to them? How many of you probably said, some kids, they will spend more time complaining about their homework than it would actually take them just to do it and turn it in. But clearly, if they felt that they could do it quickly, you would think that they would. Conduct disorder is a more serious disorder. Kids with conduct disorder violates rules and norms. They are physically hurtful to other people. They may destroy things, set fires, be cruel to animals, running away at night, lying, conning others, things like that. So you can see where maybe an higher underlying level of anger is present with conduct disorder because they're doing a lot of hurtful things. Another problem with conduct disorder is they tend not to feel guilty as much. So if you don't feel guilty for hurting other people, your incentive to dial it back isn't as strong. Depression. One thing to keep in mind about depression in kids is that they often don't look sad. More often, especially with boys, they're irritable. Okay, so they're very touchy. They have a short fuse, and you may ask them to do one little thing and they blow up. Depression can cause that. And then what happens if they get in trouble for how they're expressing it? Then they feel worse about themselves, and that just makes the depression worse. Bipolar disorder is a more severe disorder. It used to be called manic depression. People with bipolar disorder tend to have severe mood swings, alternating from depression to we call hypomania or mania. And symptoms of mania include being very distractible, being a risk taker, your sense that your thoughts are racing, you're getting less sleep. You may think that you're better than everybody else, this sense of what we call grandiosity, and you alternate between those extremes. Some people, especially kids, might cycle rapidly where they go up and down in mood multiple times in a single day. Kids with bipolar disorder have a special difficulty expressing anger because, again, there's an underlying level of depression or these manic symptoms I was telling you about before, and it does seem to be associated with anger. When you treat the bipolar disorder, often the anger gets better. Now, a lot of people felt that too many kids are being diagnosed with bipolar disorder because they don't follow the same course or pattern as you see with adults. And so they came up in 2013 with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD. And so these are kids with this disorder have troubles with extreme irritability, anger, frequent intense temper outbursts, beyond just being a moody child, okay? These are people who have an irritable or angry mood most of the day, nearly every day, have severe temper outbursts 3 or more times in a week. And by severe temper outbursts, it means that there's a little thing that just blows up and you don't let it go. These are kids who may have a 30 to 60-minute tantrum, which is a long time. If you have just ADHD, you're not going to have that long of a tantrum because your attention span isn't that long. So it's easier to just move beyond that. Okay. And obviously this causes difficulties, in functioning. Substance use disorders. So we'll talk about teenagers since hopefully your younger ones are not using substances. People with substance disorders often have more trouble with mood regulation. Often substance use is a way of self-medicating. For example, if you have somebody who has trouble with anger, teenager, and then they start smoking marijuana and find that they feel calmer, maybe they sleep better. We know that marijuana can do both of those things. But when you stop using it, then you may have more trouble with anger. So that as a parent, you may see your kid is easier to get along with when they're high than when they are not. So the trick here, of course, is that we want to get these kids on psychiatric medications if possible, because that way we can control the dosing and monitor it more carefully. Because with substance use, you may start okay at a certain level, but then you escalate. Alcohol the same way. If you have somebody, if alcohol use disorder runs in your family, your teenagers start drinking, they're not just going to have a couple of drinks and leave it. They're going to have more and more. And when you do that, especially with alcohol, a lot of times anger expression is much worse or much more intense when you're under the influence. So that can cause problems. And I see some questions. I'm going to take a stop here. What strategies to help parents and children to label their feelings? Hold on to that one. We'll talk a little bit more later on. And if I don't answer your question, please ask again. I'll double check. All right. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Not going to talk too long about that, but these are people who have experienced a trauma, and after the trauma, they're re-experiencing the trauma in ways that make them upset, angry, scared. They think that they're reliving it all over again. And so for PTSD, where anger comes into play is that you may, if something in your regular life triggers a memory of something bad that happened, you may get angry because you're trying to avoid danger. For example, let's say you're somebody who was severely bullied at school, and then you try to force the kid to go to school, and they go through the doors and they melt down. That's because they're afraid, they're re-experiencing that trauma, and of course, afraid that it's going to happen again. Anxiety disorders. People with anxiety disorders are people who worry a lot about a lot of different things. It could be social anxiety, it could be play there is if you're asking somebody who's anxious to do something that they feel is too overwhelming or that's something that's going to cause them danger, they may react very, very strongly. Kids who have separation anxiety and you try to get them into school, you end up trying to drag them into school and they're screaming and yelling because they think something really bad is going to happen. So that anger is in response to anxiety and fear. And remember, again, the fear switch we were talking about in the brain. So we think that some kids with anxiety disorders may have maybe the amygdala comes on too fast and it's too quick to see danger when it's really not there. Autism spectrum disorder. Anger is not a main symptom. It's not a symptom at all of autism, but you do see it mostly when a situation meets their difficulties in terms of handling the situation. For example, kids with autism tend to have more sensory sensitivities. So if they're overwhelmed with senses, too much noise, bad smells, things like that, they may have more trouble controlling their anger as a result of that. So if you're trying to put them in a social situation and they have a lot of social anxiety because they have no clue how to interact appropriately, you may see anger. I'm going to skip over intermittent explosive disorder. We don't really know much about that. Basically, this says that there's some people who will explode periodically. Most of the time they function fine, but every so often, which is the intermittent part, they just explode. Again, we don't quite know why that happens or what kind of treatment will help. It's hard to address a problem if it only happens periodically. With language disorders, think expressive language and expressive language problems. If you have a receptive language problem, it means that you have a hard time understanding what somebody else is saying to you, which obviously can lead you to making an incorrect assumption about that person's motives. If you have trouble with expressive language, it's harder for you to express your feelings. So that can also create frustration. It's one of the reasons why we want to teach our kids how to identify and handle these emotions. Sensory integration, I already talked a little bit about that with autism. Self-injurious behavior can also be a reflection of anger. Sometimes when people are angry at somebody else or they think that somebody's angry with them, they will cut, burn themselves, scratch themselves in an attempt to feel better, actually. But generally, people with borderline personality disorder are more inclined to engage in self-injury. It usually doesn't mean that they want to die, it just means that they want to feel better. It's a coping strategy, obviously a risky one, where we try to help kids come up with better, healthier ways of dealing with those feelings. All right. So let me move into a parent's role in childhood anger, okay? So before we start, one important question to ask yourself is, okay, do I express my anger in positive and constructive ways? Because if you struggle with it, how can you expect your kids to struggle and do a better job than you do? That you're the role models for kids in many respects, including how they handle anger. So one of the things you need to do is try to look in the mirror yourself and give yourself an honest assessment. Because if you're struggling with anger also, this actually can help you understand your child's struggles as well. So hopefully that would make you more empathetic and less likely to overreact. And I know that's easier said than done, but it is an important part that you have to look at yourself in order to change the dynamic between you and your kids. One of the things I often say to parents, I know sometimes parents are just too quick to blame themselves for everything. Kids with more anger issues may need more specialized parenting strategies. It may be for a kid that's pretty laid back, go with the flow, they don't really react too strongly and they're fine. But other kids are more sensitive to those things. If they have more difficulty, there are different parenting strategies that you can use to help them settle down. Parental mental health disorders. Okay, obviously, if you have ADHD, for example, you're going to have a harder time controlling your temper as well because you're likely to be impulsive. Even on medication, it doesn't solve it completely. If you are somebody with depression, you're going to have a harder time as well because remember that irritability that kids have. If you're depressed and then your kids get on your very last nerve and you blow up, that's going to make it harder as well because then you feel bad about it if you overreacted. One thing I'll say here, always be willing to apologize and always accept apologies from your kids when they're sincere. Nobody's perfect. If you're not losing your parental authority by saying, hey, listen, I'm sorry I overreacted. I was yelling at you and I didn't want to do that. That is such a healthy thing for kids to hear, because that lets them know that you're just human. You're going to make mistakes too. That probably makes it also easier for them to apologize, and then you work through it. That every time you apologize to each other, it actually strengthens your bond, as opposed to not admitting to anything, which tends to cause more separation. With bipolar disorder, the mood swings are definitely going to cause problems in parenting, and obviously just stress in general. The more stressed you are, the harder it's going to be to manage your child's anger and your own. Beliefs about anger. So if you think it's bad for kids to ever get angry and they should basically be listening to you obediently at all times, that's going to cause problems, okay? Because if you don't give your kids the ability and the right to express their anger constructively, it is damaging to your relationship. So again, as I said before, if you believe that your child is overwhelmed or overloaded, it's going to be easier for you to respond constructively. So one of the things that you really want to do when it comes to kids who are angry, and you feel like it's meeting that disrespect line, instead of immediately saying, don't talk to me that way, or that you're being disrespectful, a much more sensitive, caring way of responding would be to say, hey, listen, I want to hear why you're so mad, but if you're going to yell and scream at me, I can't listen if you're going to yell and scream. If you can bring it down a few notches, yeah, we can talk about it. And very often, if you take that approach, kids will calm down. And if you can see them lowering it a little bit, they're responding to what you said. So give them a chance, even if they're really frustrated and they're angry and even yelling or raising their tone of voice, try to help them calm down. It's not just about stopping the anger. It's about helping them process it in a healthy way. This goes along with child rearing style as well. If you expect blind obedience and you don't get it, you're going to have more trouble with kids being angry. If you're overly permissive, your kids are not going to become self-disciplined, because basically whatever they say is fine. And so then when you try to clamp down, they're going to respond negatively. And then you're going to get upset and feel like, well, they're just taking you for granted. They don't care about you, things of that nature, which again, either extreme is not healthy. Stress burnout. I don't know. If I were to ask how many of you are feeling stressed or burned out right now, I'm sure most of you would say yes. It's been a very difficult couple of years here. So it's hard to take care of yourself sometimes, but I will say, make sure you spend some time taking care of yourself, even if it's 30 minutes here or there. You need some downtime as well. And it's okay to tell your kids that you're really stressed about something, because kids often have a very strong ability to empathize, especially as they get older. And if they see you stressed out and they're actually trying to help you feel better, it's a wonderful thing. It doesn't mean that you're expecting them to parent you. We're not talking about that, but you're helping them develop their empathy by having them be sensitive to that. What's one of the things I do in therapy with kids, I try to help them see things from their parents' point of view, which again helps them calm down. All right. We're going to talk about the love and logic responses to anger. After we do this, I'll see if there's any other questions here. So if you haven't read the books Parenting with Love and Logic or Parenting Teens with Love and Logic, I highly recommend them. I think their parenting strategies are awesome. I think that what most people report to me is that once they use them, things are much calmer at home. Okay. So according to Love and Logic Parenting, you set limits, but in firm but loving ways, so that you're clear, that's the firmness, but you're also caring and loving about it. That can often be giving them an explanation for what's going on. To say, hey, listen, we can't have you writing on the walls. If you want to write on the paper, that is fine. If you keep writing on the walls, I'm gonna have to take your crayons so that you don't keep doing that. So think about how you want to handle this. That way you're giving them a response, you're giving them an alternative, instead of just immediately punishing when you see something going wrong. Allowing kids to struggle with the consequences for their poor choices instead of rescuing them, okay? When kids struggle with the consequences, they become more self-motivated, they become more responsible for their own actions, and they're gonna have an easier time to do well. For example, your child forgets to do his homework and it's 10 o'clock at night and all of a sudden they're wanting all this help from you and going to the store. Instead of saying, well, you should have thought about that, I was telling you about that last week. Instead, a love and logic response would be, wow, I'm really sorry to hear that. It sounds like you're really nervous right now about getting this project done. But it's my bedtime, so I'm going to go home. But I wish you luck, and I'm sure you'll come through it. And then you give them a kiss and you go to bed. Well, what about you? I'm just going to fail. It's like, well, I love you too much to argue with you. It's my bedtime, But if you come to me next time earlier, I'd be more than happy to help you. So you're holding your limit, but again, you can hear the love coming through. Show them that manipulation, arguing are very ineffective ways of getting what they want. So be very careful. Kids are really good about that. And so if you see it coming, you will be more able to counteract that. Empathy must always come before the consequence. Again, it allows you to hold kids accountable while maintaining a loving relationship. And one thing to keep in mind here with regard to anger, and angry kids are harder to love, let's just be honest. They can get on your last nerve. So, but when you maintain a loving relationship and they realize that you're both on the same team and that really their bad choices become the bad guy, not them, their motivation to try to please you and to do well will increase. If you're overly harsh and you don't show any empathy, they're more likely to not be very caring either, and they're not going to care about your feelings. So, and as kids get older, the quality of your relationship will have a lot to do with the choices they make as teenagers, because they're going to be away from you a lot more. You want them to think about you when they're tempted to use drugs, tempted to drink, tempted to take a car without permission, etc. Don't try to convince them why you're being fair. Sometimes if you try to tell them why they're wrong, they're just going to argue with you more. So if they think you're being unfair, you can empathize with frustration instead. Say, yeah, I know it feels that way to you. You know, I get that you don't feel like it's fair. That way you're acknowledging it. You don't necessarily change it. You're not trying to convince them otherwise. But that's not to say you can't listen to them. If you ask them, you know, if they're not in trouble and they feel this way, to give some examples and say, well, what can we do to make it better? That way you engage in a more problem-solving mode. Lectures and threats make things worse. Use the energy drain technique instead. So, for example, if they're giving you a hard time and you're exhausted, your energy is drained, you can just stop doing anything for them. You can get on the couch and maybe there's something they want to do. And you say, well, I'm just too tired. I've been listening to you arguing all day and I don't have any energy left for dinner or to help you do your homework or anything. You know, but if you take care of some of these things, you know, if you vacuum the floor and you do these things for me, maybe I have enough, maybe my energy would come back. Again, it shows them that there's a reaction. There's a consequence to their behaviors and gives them an opportunity to make it better. You'll see this a little bit in a couple examples I'm going to read to you. Don't rub their nose in the consequences, salt in the wound. If they're already feeling bad enough about what they did, you don't need to make it worse. The phrase, I love you too much to argue with you, is a classic love and logic response. So if they're trying to push you, they're trying to manipulate you and get you to like back off on consequences or whatever, you say, I love you too much to argue with you. And you just say that. It's telling them, I love you, but I'm not going to engage with you. And once they realize that they're not going to get anywhere, they may get upset, they may storm off, but all that's okay. So if they do it that way. So let me read you a couple of things here. This is the book. This is on your resource list, by the way. Let's see. Can you see it? No, it's not showing up. So, oh, there we go. Sorry. I'll just tell you. Love and Logic Magic When Kids Leave You Speechless. It's a great book because it gives you all sorts of different scenarios and how you might react. And this will give you I'm going to read just 2 vignettes because I think it gives you a good idea as to how it works in practice. So this one here is about swearing. Okay, so child says, I hate this damn chore. Father says, I know, that's a great word for saying how you feel as long as nobody else hears it. So say it as much as you want in your room, outside, in the bathroom, anywhere nobody has to hear it. And the child says, well, I hate this chore. Damn chore, whatever. Will you take that word someplace else? The child says, why should I? So the father says, well, I'm just thinking that something very sad might happen if you don't. Well, I hate doing this stupid job. I know, and thanks for listening. Child says, what are you going to do if I don't do this stuff? And the father says in a very soft voice, which actually gets your kid's attention more than yelling, you know, that would be so sad. I guess I'd have to hire someone to do it and pay them with money from your savings. What a drag. Child says, you can't do that. And the father walks away and just says, I love you too much to argue about this. Try not to worry about it. Okay. So in this example, cussing didn't become a way for his son to get attention, entertainment, or control by upsetting you, which is often the goal. Okay, didn't become a way for the boy to punish his dad. The dad avoided a control battle with his son, preserved their relationship, and the kid is learning that being angry or frustrated is okay as long as you don't use hurtful or offensive language around others. So let me try this one. Next. Okay, this is a tip. Enforce a curfew for teenagers at all costs. Smart parents delay the consequence. Okay, so when the teens come home at 12:45 a.m. instead of 10 p.m., they just look at the kid and say, "Oh, I was so worried. I'm glad you're here." Okay, so sometimes you may have to give yourself a little time to come up with a consequence. So hear this. This is a parent handling a problem with his teenage daughter. Teen walks in the door at 12:45 a.m. and the parent says in a sincere, sad tone, "Oh, I'm so glad you're okay. I was worried sick. Thank goodness you're home. Give me a hug." The teen says, "Me and Ray were talking. We just lost track of time." Parent says, "The most important thing is that you are okay." And the teen says, "You're not mad?" The parent says calmly but firmly, "I'm so mad I can't see straight. I'm going to have to do something about all the worry that you caused for me, but I'm not going to do anything until I think about it for a while. Get some sleep. Try not to worry about it." The teen says, "What are you going to do?" The parent whispers, "I don't know. It'll be fair, but try not to worry about it tonight." So the next day, teenager calls father at work. "I can't believe you put a lock on the steering wheel. I'm late for school and it's all your fault. Come home and take it off." Parent says, "I'll be happy to take the lock off your steering wheel when I know that I won't have to worry about you coming home late. I'll see you after work." The teen says, "This sucks," and hangs up. A week later, dad takes the lock off the wheel. Teen says, "I can't believe you did that, Dad. If you really loved me, you wouldn't make such a big deal out of this curfew." And parent says, "I'm sorry you feel that way. I took the lock off because I know that tonight you'll be home by 10. Teen says, "You can't tell me what to do." Parent says, "I know, but I think you'll make a wise choice, and I love you too much to argue." Okay, so so one thing I want you to listen for in that is how calm the parent is trying to stay. And by staying calm, the parent actually is asserting control, but in a loving way. So I hope you're hearing that. So the rest of the talk is going to be about different strategies you can use, but let me check to see if there's any other questions. So labeling their feelings, actually, we've got something about that. So I'll come back to that. Let's look at the chats. Yeah, thanks. I think I responded to that already. So I'll give you time for more questions at the end. Okay, so first of all, how you can help angry kids, you have to stay in control of your own anger as much as possible. As I said earlier, think fire extinguisher. Because when you're doing that, instead of pouring gasoline on the fire, it's going to make things better. Because remember, in terms of discipline, the goal in disciplining kids is not to punish, it's to teach, okay? We're trying to teach them how to make better choices. We're teaching them how to keep their anger under better control, okay? And obviously, again, some kids come by their anger issues honestly. If you have an issue with anger, probably your child is as well. But hopefully, by thinking about the things that we've talked about so far today, you'll be more sympathetic towards their plight and think of some ways that you can help them. So, all right, listen and reflect your child's angry feelings rather than shut them down immediately. This helps you take it less personally, gets to the heart of the matter, okay? This can also soften your urge to overpower your kids with lectures, punishments, arguing, etc. Okay, arguing, regulating emotions, and managing behavior are skills that develop slowly with practice over time. Okay. So this is probably more than anything else. Even if you disagree with whatever your child is feeling, to validate that and give it back to them so they hear it. If you can sort of mirror what they're feeling, what happens again is their anger level comes down and they see you more in a more compassionate way. So you're not the enemy, because the anger you get, the anger they are back to you. And again, it just does harm to the relationship. Gently raising your tone a bit to convey emotional understanding. That's also very helpful. And why I say this is that you want, with your tone, to let them know that it is an important issue to you. So instead of "Thanks for telling me why you're angry," it's kind of a flat tone. Instead, "Well, I can understand why you'd be so angry about that. You did all this work and you got your homework done and then you forgot it at home. I can understand why you'd be upset with that." Okay, not shaming, just reflecting those feelings. And again, when you raise your tone, that also helps your child sort of think about it a little bit better. Create an anger thermometer or ladder. All right, here's an example of that. I'm skipping ahead. So this is how it feels. You start with calm to annoyed, upset, frustrated, angry, furious. And so this would be a way of talking with your children about this. You say, okay, which of these things describes you best? You can give them some of these examples and how it feels. That's very helpful. I couldn't find a good anger control thermometer. You might be able to find one online. And the nice thing is you go from 0 to like 100 degrees. And again, if you can sort of quantify about how angry the child is, that helps them understand it. The other thing with anger also, and think about emotions in general. Very often what's behind anger is sadness and hurt. So if you can get behind the sadness and hurt, then you're much more, what it does is it brings the anger level down and allows you to then process that feeling and go for it. For example, you have a younger sibling violating their older sibling's privacy repeatedly. And so then the older sibling becomes angry and then shuts the other one out. And everybody's frustrated and sad. So instead, if you help the younger child realize, hey, I think your feelings are really hurt. You really wish Billy would play with you sometimes, but he always says no. So I can see why you'd be sad. You think that yelling at him or stealing his stuff makes it better, or does it make it worse? Okay, well, how else could we approach this that would make it better? Again, you're one of the things about Love and Logic parenting is they talk about consultant parenting. And that's what your goal is, that you are a consultant. You're helping kids explore a situation and come up with some possible solutions or better ways of handling it than the ways that they're using, which are not working very well. Recognize and praise effort in controlling anger. So this is an example where you know how your child tends to express anger. If you see them trying to tamp it down, make sure you always recognize that. To say, for example, hey, Derek, I saw how angry you were getting in your little brother, but I also saw you trying to calm it down and move away. I'm really proud of you. I know that's not hard, that's not easy for you. Way to go. Or if your child is arguing with you and you can see them using some sort of control, you can tell that they're trying, that they're struggling. Say, I see how hard you're working to try to keep this under control. I know this is a big issue for you. One of the things that can help with that is if the anger is if it's getting too far afield, to have a timeout, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Teaching kids to ways of calming down and to model it. For example, if you're frustrated about a situation, you say, okay, I'm just going to take a few deep breaths, or I've asked you 3 times to set the table and you're still not doing it, and I'm really upset. I'm going to go for a walk for a little bit, and then I'll come back. Or, I'm not going to let this get to me. And one of the ways that you can model to calm down is even if you're having a situation at home or at the office, sometimes you can use that and tell your child, this is what happened at work and this is how I handled it. And I'm not saying that's so that you're just using your kids as your sounding board and sort of burdening them with your problems. You can do it proactively so that you're using it as an opportunity to teach your child ways of calming down, okay? Because if they see you doing it, they're more likely to do it themselves. All right, develop a calm down plan. And this is something where planning ahead is really helpful, okay? So you may have a calming corner that they can go to. Some teachers do this in their classrooms, and that children, if they're feeling overwhelmed emotionally, can go in the corner, they just sit down, there's maybe a pillow or something, and then they come back when they're calmer. Because a lot of times people look at timeout as a punishment. I don't really look at it that way. If you look at timeout as a coping strategy, a way of having some distance when the emotions are getting too high, can work much better, much better. And that's important also, that you can ask for a timeout or your children can ask for a timeout. Again, back to the modeling things. If you say, hey, I'm so angry about this, I can't talk to you right now. Because if I talk to you about it now, I'm going to start yelling and screaming, and I don't want to do that. So let's talk in an hour. Let's talk tomorrow morning. That gives you time to settle down. Likewise, if you're talking with your teenager and they're asking you to leave you alone, they don't want to talk about it, and you're just pushing it, to say, hey, you need a little bit more time to kind of process this, and how about if we talk about it later? Most teenagers will be okay with that, and kids as well. That gives them a time to calm down, and then they have to use their own resources to try to calm down. With developing a calm down plan, look at this, you can have like a little bag of tricks almost. Okay, so what are some things that kids do to calm themselves down? If you think of a calm down kit, it could involve some crayons, a favorite coloring book, a fun book to read, some stickers, a favorite toy, lotion that smells good, a little aromatherapy. So, and then when you see your child struggling, to say, hey, what would you think about using your some of your calm down strategies now, and see if that helps you calm down. Redirecting your child's anger is also a very good thing. And what I mean by that is you don't want to just stop the anger. You want to redirect it from something that's hurtful to something that's helpful. For example, I know you're really mad, but hitting is not going to help. If you want to hit this pillow, that would be fine. How about you hit it as hard as you can? And maybe you even hold the pillow for your child to do it, or they do it with their bed. Now, this is a little controversial because some kids tend to get worse. It just revs them up. Other kids will do it for a while and they come down and they say, I feel better. Other kids will just go for a walk for a little bit. They may watch a little TV or YouTube, but they get to know what strategies work well for them. And different strategies are going to work better or worse for different people. Let me back up. I forgot to pick your battles wisely. If you get upset over every little thing that your child does or your spouse does, the negativity that can occur makes everyone more likely to get angry and overreact. So again, taking a deep breath, count to 10, leaving dirty clothes on the floor. It's not the end of the world, you know. It's not the most important thing. I know that frustrates a lot of people. Using humor. So this is a tricky one. One of the ways that humor can work is that humor is a higher level function in the brain. You know, animals don't share that with us. They're generally not funny. They don't try to make you laugh, or maybe it seems like they are. I don't know. But if you use humor, what you're doing is you're activating the frontal lobes of the brain to try to tamp down the emotional parts of the brain. So, for example, if you're both angry, you can take a break and say, okay, let's take a break. Let's come back in 30 minutes and we'll have this argument in 30 minutes. And you come back with underwear on your head or something, and you're trying to talk about it. Your child's going to laugh, right? So most likely they're going to laugh. Maybe they get something funny as well. And so then you try to have the discussion while you're wearing funny hats or whatever it might be. And it brings it brings the temperature down so that it's easier to talk and resolve the problem. Okay. What you don't want to do is you be sarcastic about it, or you use it at their expense, laughing at them. Obviously, that's not going to help. So you're trying to break the mood. One of the things that actually one of my patients long ago came up with in terms of a self-calming strategy, instead of saying it's no big deal, she would say, well, it's no biggie piggy, no biggie piggy. And it just would make her laugh when she did it. And so when you say that to yourself, it makes you smile, and then your anger level comes down a notch. All right, so don't give in to tantrums. So let me talk about this one. Sometimes kids discover that angry outbursts are a very effective way of getting their needs met or getting their attention. If your child throws a temper tantrum and you finally, out of frustration, give in and give them a toy to keep them quiet or whatever, they learn that temper tantrums are effective ways of getting what they want. So be very careful. In general, you should not give in to tantrums. Okay? You can express or reflect their frustration, but you don't want to change your mind and then do what they're asking, because then you're rewarding the tantrum. Okay? So you can let them know that you understand how frustrated they are, that they can't do something, they're unhappy with the consequence, but don't rub it in. Having said that, though, there are times when compromising or negotiating can help, especially with kids with severe anger issues. So, for example, if you have a kid who's on the verge of getting very upset, instead to say, hey, listen, you've lost the privilege of doing this, and I know you're mad about it, but tell you what, how about if you do this, which might be another easier thing for them to do, maybe you give them a little bit of something, or something an alternative. For example, say your child does not clean his room, and that's really important, and he promised to do it on Friday, and it's not that. And then he expects to go out with his friends Friday night. You say, well, I'm sorry, you chose not to clean your room, so no, you don't have my permission to go out. That's not right, blah, 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 and gets upset and goes in the room and slams his door. And maybe comes back and maybe apologizes or whatnot. You say, well, tell you what, I really appreciate you apologizing, and you're talking to me calmly now. Tell you what, how about if we get this much done, then yeah, you still can't go out, but maybe we could watch a movie or play a game. How does that sound? And if that works and gets them redirected, what you're doing is you're giving them a partial reward, not what they wanted, but what you're doing is you're rewarding them for calming down. Does that make sense? You're not giving it when they're super angry, yelling and screaming. You're getting it, they get something, not what they really wanted, but some alternative. For calming down. So Dr. Green, he's the author again of The Explosive Child, came up with this basket theory a while ago. He talks about it a little differently now, but I like the way he put it initially. So basically, when you're trying to deal with a child's issues, anger, whatever, think of it as 3 different baskets, okay? So basket A are the essential safety behaviors, okay? So things that are non-negotiable. So wearing a seatbelt in the car, that's non-negotiable. Keeping hands and feet to yourself, hitting and kicking others, riding without a helmet on, on their bike, whatever. And so those things you're going to risk a meltdown because you can't allow them to do things that are dangerous. Basket C are the behaviors which once seemed important, but are not really a top priority and certainly not worth a meltdown. Okay, the clothes a child wears, what the child will or will not eat, keeping the room clean. Again, I'm not saying give up on it entirely, but for now, when you're trying to help a child who struggles with anger control, you're giving them some time. You're just letting that go for now. Then basket B, these are high priority behaviors, things that you want your kids to do, but not worth the total power struggle that will result in an explosive meltdown. And I understand sometimes it's easy just to give in because you're exhausted. Don't beat yourself over it. It's not the most helpful thing, but it's not the end of the world if that happens either. So here, though, for that basket B is where compromising negotiation can be helpful. So there's an issue, it's something they want to do, and you're not sure that you want them to do it. Maybe you say to them, okay, tell you what, give me some reasons why you think I should let you do this. All right. Well, then, are you willing to listen to my concerns? My concerns are this. If I allow you to do this, this could happen. And so can you come up with a compromise? And then you go back and forth. Because if you come up with a compromise that you and your child can live with, you are avoiding the complete meltdown and teaching them some valuable skills that hopefully in the future, they'll be able to do the negotiating first before they're already in trouble and starting to have a meltdown. Because again, once you're having a meltdown, your thinking shuts off. There's no point in trying to compromise or negotiate with somebody who's screaming at the top of their lungs. It just can't happen. Okay. So here's an example of how this might go. I know it's important for you to keep watching TV. I want you to be able to do this, but I also know that you have homework that needs to get done. Let's try to come up with a compromise where you'll get some of what you want and I'll get some of what I want. Okay. The goal is, again, not for the adult to win. The goal is to solve the problem without a meltdown. And he calls this collaborative problem solving. And he says that this is so important for these kids who struggle with emotional regulation. Follow through with consequences. That's obviously important. That's one of the issues, actually, if your consequence is too long. If you ground somebody for 2 weeks because of an action that they had, then it may, two things. One is it might engender more anger on your child's part. And as a parent, what else are you going to use if they're already grounded? So adding more grounding isn't going to help. Sort of like having 3 or 4 life sentences. That 3rd or 4th life sentence is not a motivator to not go out and do the same crime all over again. Okay. And in terms of being consistent and following through, it's okay to change your mind. Okay. So if you give a consequence and then later on you realize that it maybe was overreacting on your part, it's okay to come back to your child and say, hey, listen, I've been thinking about it. I think I overreacted. I think that this consequence I gave you was a little bit too harsh. What do you think? And then you can talk about it, because and what you're doing in that case is you're modeling being human. You're modeling making mistakes. You're modeling how to handle overreacting. And you'd like your kids to be able to do the same. Let's see. Teaching kids conflict resolution skills. I already talked a little bit about this earlier. Think of brainstorming as something that can happen. If there's an issue here, whether between a couple of your kids or you and your child, whatever, to say, okay, how do we resolve this conflict? And you provide the structure to say, okay, what are some ways, this is the problem. And you write down and see what each person thinks the problem is. Okay, what are some possible solutions? And when you're brainstorming, you're not saying yes or no to any of them. You're coming down with a list. This is what they do also in couples counseling, by the way. So you come up with a list of possible solutions. Then we'll say, okay, let's take a look. Are there any of these solutions that you think we're probably not going to be able to agree on? You may be able to cross out some. And then maybe a few you're willing to try. And so maybe you try the resolution, you try it for a week or so. Let's see how that goes. If it works well, fine. If it doesn't work well, then we come up with something different. Good example of this is homework. Most of you probably wouldn't mind when your child does his or her homework as long as it gets done. And so if your child wants to play first and do it later, if they actually do it later like they promise, then they get to do it their way. If they want to try it this way and then it doesn't work because by the time they finish playing, they don't have the energy and it causes a fight, then it's obviously going to go back to your way of doing things. But your child realizes that you gave them a chance and it just didn't work. So it may be that was just asking too much. If you have a child on medication, waiting till 7 or 8 o'clock at night to do work may not be so good because medicine's worn off, for example. Avoiding violent media and video games. I'm not a big fan of first-person shooter games. I don't play them, but I know obviously a lot of kids do. But I generally tell parents is this. Certainly when they're younger, 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't think it's appropriate. However, there are some kids who are able to do that and it does not affect their behavior. And so if you have a child doing that and they're still caring, they help with chores, they get off when you ask them to get off, I'm less concerned about it. If you have a child who really struggles with anger, sometimes what happens is that when they're playing these video games, it's getting them all pumped up. Remember the fight or flight response. So they're getting all pumped up, but with the video game, you're not discharging it through activity. So you stay revved up, and so that can cause problems. They might be more likely to be hurtful to family members. And if that's the case, I think it's wise to say, hey, we're going to take a break from that. It's because it's a privilege. Now, some of you may just say you don't want them ever to play it. They're probably going to play it sometimes at other people's houses. There's not a whole lot you can do about that. But very importantly, have a discussion about it with your child. They may not agree with you, but again, you're the parents. Think of parenting always as a benevolent dictatorship. You're the boss, but you give children a voice so that their concerns are heard and they also get a chance to affect that. Finally, consider omega-3 supplements. There's some research that says that omega-3 supplements, fish oil basically, can be very helpful to kids who suffer from ADHD, depression, and anger control. So just very briefly, all your brain cells, your neurons are coated with myelin, which is made out of omega-3. If you don't get enough of it in your diet, you may be deficient, and that tends to lead to more irritability. So it's something, Cormega and Nordic Naturals are two of the brands that are recommended. Dr. Daniel Amen of the Amen Clinic recommends it as well. My experience is when kids are taking it, they do tend to do better with their anger. So I think, short of trying psychiatric medication, which can have more side effects, this might be a way to go. So at least look into it. So, and feel free to, I would just recommend mention it to your pediatrician, child's pediatrician. So there isn't some reason why you wouldn't do that. All right. Here's a handout here about getting your angries out. This gives kids a bunch of ideas as to how to handle it. There are more handouts at the website at the bottom. So I just wanted to share this. Teaching them, for example, I feel mad when you do this. And it's a very good way of expressing anger. All right, so let me summarize and then see if you guys have any questions. So kids struggle with handling big emotions, okay? That's part of growing up. Adults struggle too, we're not perfect. Anger is one of the hardest emotions to be able to handle. But we have to be the adult in the room. We have to be the one who takes responsibility for controlling and regulating our own emotions when we're trying to help our kids, who should be our students. If you see them as students still learning, you're not going to expect them to get it right every single time when they get upset. That we can teach them to self-regulate so that those abilities improve. They're not going to be as strong in a child as they will be in an adult. So again, you need to be more aware of that, and maybe more empathetic with their struggles. But handling them well by using some of these strategies, I can promise you, will make home life much easier. One last thing I want to say here before we open up to some more questions is, if your child is already in therapy, consult with your child's therapist, because it may be that your particular child, one of these strategies would definitely not be okay. So please keep that in mind. All right. This is some of my contact information. Our CFCC website has a number of different resources. If you look at my website, jamesjchris.com, you'll find some information on some of the books that I've written, including MAD, How to Deal with Your Anger and Get Respect, which is for teenagers struggling with anger. My email if you have some follow-up questions you want to ask. And here's some website resources. There's a couple of things here that some of the handouts I think I gave you came from some of these sites. So feel free to go to these websites and download them. These are some books for kids and teens. How to Take the Grow Out of the Anger is one of my favorite ones for kids. What to do when your temper flares. Again, if you teach kids how to manage their emotions more constructively, they're going to be happier as well. Here's some books for parents, and I think we're good. So let me go back. Let's look at some questions. So yes, some of the books I mentioned are in the handout, so at the end. So we got that one. Let's see. I think I've answered these questions as well. Does anybody else have any questions? I know I threw a lot of information at you, so take some time, review the slides when you get a chance. And again, there are plenty of resources out there. Be patient, it does get better.
Just remember that I will be sending out a copy of these slides and a link to the recording next week. This is Jan Russell, so. Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you, Dr. Christ.
You're very welcome.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now, and everybody, thank you for attending, and hope you'll attend some of our other workshops. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Christ.
You're very welcome.